The wind in Vermont had a peculiar sound at the end of October. It wasn't the violent whistle of winter, nor the soft whisper of spring. It was a murmur that slipped through the dry oak leaves and hid in the cracks of old window frames, as if the season itself asked for silence. And Ethan Moore was a man who understood silence. The house he lived in, on the outskirts of Montpelier, was white wood with peeling paint. Built by his grandfather, passed down to his father, and finally to him, a burden inherited and cherished. Since Martha passed away 7 years ago, the house seemed to breathe slower. The furniture smelled of time, and every room reminded him of what had been. Laughter at breakfast, the clack of a typewriter, her footsteps in the kitchen. Ethan had taught literature for over 3 decades at the local university. He was known among students for his soft voice and his ability to recite Dickinson from memory. He never had children. Martha couldn't conceive, and they both accepted that fate with a quiet bitterness. Now, at 74, his life consisted of afternoon tea, unanswered letters from old colleagues, and books stacked around his reading chair. There was no television. The old radio still worked, but only played classical music on Sundays. He jotted thoughts into spiral notebooks, wrote poems no one ever read, and sometimes recited verses aloud as if the house itself were his final audience. No one visited anymore. The neighbours had moved or died. The younger people in town didn't even know who he was. But Ethan didn't mind. He had learned to survive on a hot teapot, a wool blanket, and the precise memory of Martha's voice reading to him on the couch. Until one day a letter arrived. It was simple, carefully folded, handwritten. A youthful, steady and emotional script. The sender was April Green, a senior English literature student at the University of Vermont. She wrote that she had read an old article about Professor Ethan Moore, that his poems had deeply touched her, and that she would love, if he allowed, to meet him, to learn from him. To hear his voice reciting the verses she silently memorized in her dorm room. Ethan held on to that letter for days, rereading it like one stroke's a memory. He didn't reply right away. He wasn't sure if he should. What young person today wanted to hear an old man talk about words? But there was something in that letter, something that escaped the ink and entered his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Loneliness, once comfortable, began to feel a bit too tight. And so, on a cold November morning, when the fog still blanketed the fields and the kettle began to whistle, Ethan opened the door. April was there. Young, with restless eyes, a coat too big for her small frame, and a notebook clutched to her chest like a shield. Ethan looked at her a moment too long. "Mr. Moore?" she asked. He simply nodded, stepping aside with a quiet gesture. That morning something broke through the silence of the house and the rustle of trees, as if poetry, long buried with Martha, had returned to fetch him. Subscribe to never miss real stories that touch the heart and challenge everything you believe about love and time. The journey to Ethan Moore's house had been longer than she anticipated, not in miles, but in time. The campus shuttle dropped her off nearly a mile from the gravel road that led to his place. Her boots crunched on the frozen ground as she walked, the Vermont wind pulling at the edges of her coat. She carried a single notebook in her bag and a folded copy of one of Ethan's poems, the ink already smudged from her fingers. She had read his work during a late-night internet dive, looking for older, forgotten American poets. His verses didn't try to be clever, they felt like whispered truths. Simple, sorrowful, unafraid of silence. It was a kind of writing that made her breath hitch, because it didn't try to impress. It just existed, like someone who had stopped needing to be seen and started simply telling, written the letter on impulse. Never really expected a reply, but he had called the university office, left a message with a time and an address. No explanation, no greeting. Just, if she wants to come, this is when. And now here she was. His house smelled of cedar and old paper. It was dim, not cold, but not warm either, the kind of chill that clings to bookshelves and wool rugs. She stepped in slowly, not wanting to disturb anything. Her fingers stayed curled around the strap of her bag. "Sit anywhere," Ethan said, gesturing vaguely toward a dining table pushed against the window. His voice was the same as in the recordings she'd found online. Low, calm, never rushed. He poured hot water over a pair of tea bags and handed her a cup without asking what she liked. I wasn't sure you'd really come, he said, finally sitting down across from her. April smiled faintly. I wasn't sure either, but I had to. That made something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or memory. They didn't speak much at first. She leafed through her notebook, showed him a few of her poems, clumsy, honest things about loss and dislocation. He didn't compliment them, didn't criticize either. He asked questions. Why did you end the line here? What does this word mean to you? How did it feel when you wrote that? It wasn't a lesson, it was a quiet kind of excavation. They spent 2 hours like that. No small talk, just tea and poems and long pauses that didn't need filling. When she stood to leave, the sun was already beginning to sink, casting orange stripes across the floor. I'll come again, she said softly. As she reached the door, he nodded. All right. She stepped back into the cold, but the chill didn't bite as much now. Her hands were still warm from the cup. Inside, Ethan stood in the same spot for a while, staring at the door. Then, without a word, he walked over to the cluttered corner of the room, pulled out an old notebook and began to write. For the first time in years, he didn't write alone. Something shifted after that first visit. Ethan didn't say it aloud. He rarely spoke more than necessary, but he felt it in the way he moved through his home. The mornings no longer dragged with the weight of sameness. He found himself putting water on the stove before she arrived, not out of politeness, but anticipation. April began coming every Tuesday and Friday afternoon. She never stayed more than 2 or 3 hours, never came too early or too late. There was a rhythm to it, unspoken but steady, like the syllables of a well-written line. And slowly the house began to change. She brought things, without asking, without ceremony. A small plant that needed sun and took root by the kitchen window. A jar of local honey she swore helped concentration. Once she brought an anthology of contemporary poetry, left it on the table and never mentioned it again. Ethan didn't touch it for a week, but when he did, he found a note tucked inside. Page 78 reminded me of the way you pause before saying something difficult. He didn't know what to do with that sentence. And yet, he started brushing his hair in the mornings, trimmed his beard. He dusted the shelves. One afternoon, without quite understanding why, he opened the windows and let the cold air rush in. April noticed. She noticed everything, though she said very little. When he changed the tea blend, she raised an eyebrow but smiled. When he rearranged the books, she traced the new order with her finger. Once, when he wore a sweater he hadn't used in years, she simply said, "That colour suits you." He hadn't blushed in decades, but that day he did. Their conversations deepened. They still talked poetry, but the lines between personal and professional blurred. April spoke about her father, about how she used to hear him recite poems under his breath while shaving, how his death had left something unfinished in her, like a sentence without punctuation. Ethan told her about Martha, though never in full, only fragments, her laugh when she misquoted Shakespeare, the way she touched books like they were living things. There was no pretense between them, no performance. They spoke slowly, allowing silence to bloom between words. And in that silence, something began to grow. It wasn't romantic, not in the usual sense. Ethan was too old, too aware of the years carved into his skin, and April was too young, still building her understanding of love and the many forms it could take. But what passed between them, through poems, glances, quiet gestures, was undeniably tender and new and deeply, dangerously alive. By late December, the rooms of Ethan's home no longer echoed. The house breathed again. Not loudly, not with noise, but with presence. And for the first time in years, so did he. It was in the way he began to write again that April truly understood something had changed. Ethan had stopped putting pen to paper after Martha died. He still scribbled thoughts, lines that started with promise then trailed off. But the discipline, the care, the willingness to shape pain into language, that had vanished. Until one afternoon, without a word, he handed her a page. It wasn't finished. The handwriting was careful but uncertain. The poem spoke of winter, of time suspended in frost, of warmth found in a stranger's voice. She read it twice before looking up. "You wrote this for her?" she asked gently. Ethan didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the window, to the snow falling in slow spirals. Then, almost inaudibly, "I didn't know who it was for until now." April said nothing. She folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the table. Some feelings didn't need to be named to be understood. From that day on, poetry returned to their sessions, not just as analysis, but as creation. They read aloud, sometimes switching mid-verse. April's voice was lighter, a bit unsure, but full of breath. Ethan's was slow, weighted with years, but each word rang clear as if cut from stone. One Friday afternoon, she brought him a poem of her own, a long, winding piece about a young girl walking through fog. It wasn't polished, but it was raw, intimate. He read it in silence, then placed his hand over hers for just a second. It was the only time they touched. There were other gestures. April began staying a little longer, sometimes helping clean the teacups. She brought soup once from a diner she liked near campus. Ethan tried to pretend he didn't care for it, but she caught the way he scraped the bowl clean. He, in turn, began setting aside books for her. Not just the obvious ones, but those he thought would challenge her, unsettle her. In the quiet of the house, memory and presence began to coexist. Ethan found himself remembering Martha less like a wound and more like a song he could hum without hurting. April filled the space not by replacing anything, but by being exactly what she was, newness wrapped in reverence. They didn't talk about the outside world. April never brought up her classes, friends, or the dorm. Ethan didn't mention the doctors, the pills on his kitchen shelf, or the occasional tremor in his hand. Inside that house, time seemed suspended, not in denial, but in grace. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was no longer just companionship either. What grew between them was not rushed, not planned. It breathed like the poems they read together, full of rhythm, restraint, and something that waited patiently in the white space between the lines. They never spoke of feelings, not directly. There was an understanding between them, delicate and unspoken. Like the soft thread in a handmade quilt, it ran beneath everything, holding warmth together without ever drawing attention to itself. April started arriving without knocking, so she'd open the door quietly as if she belonged there. Ethan no longer waited by the window, but always had 2 cups ready. It became ritual: tea, shared silence, a new poem or an old one revisited. Some days they said very little, but it never felt like a gap. It felt like breath. He noticed the small things, how she always sat with her knees tucked under her, how she tilted her head when trying to find the right word. He started writing more poems, though never admitted they were for her. They often began with nature, frost on a branch, the weight of snow on pine. But the real subject was always what stirred beneath that, a yearning that asked for nothing but to be near. She, in turn, began bringing verses folded into her coat pocket. Not always hers, sometimes Szymborska, sometimes Merwin, but she'd underline certain lines, and Ethan would understand the message in them. One day, she slid across a small poem with only 3 words circled, and still waiting. Neither of them talked about what that meant. One cold evening in January, she fell asleep in the armchair beside his. It was just past 5, but already dark outside. The wood stove crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ethan didn't move for a long time. He watched her chest rise and fall under the blanket, her hand still lightly resting on the book they had been reading. There was a softness in that moment he hadn't known in years. It wasn't desire, it wasn't fatherly either. It was something in between, a tenderness that lived outside of roles. He felt the ache of it in his chest, but it didn't hurt. Not really. It reminded him that he was still human. When she woke up, she looked embarrassed. "I didn't mean to," she started, but he shook his head. "It's all right." She stayed a little longer that night. They didn't read, they didn't talk. They just sat, both of them wrapped in separate thoughts, sharing the same silence. April left around 9. At the door, she turned back and said, "I like it here. It's quiet, but not empty." Ethan nodded and closed the door slowly after her. Later, he stood in front of his mirror, trying to understand the way his face looked now. Different, somehow. Less shadowed, as if a small lamp had been lit from inside. There was no name for what was happening between them. But in the poems they shared, in the quiet they protected, it found its place. Wordless, patient, real. The snowstorm came without warning. It was late February, a Thursday, and April had arrived early, saying she felt something strange in the air. By late afternoon, the sky turned the colour of pewter, and the wind began to moan like an old door left ajar. "I should probably leave soon," she said, glancing out the window. Ethan checked the forecast on the small radio by the kitchen. The announcer's voice was calm but firm. Roads were closing, visibility dropping. He looked at her, saw the worry stitched across her brow. "You're not going back tonight," he said. "Not a question. A decision." She hesitated, then nodded. Okay. It was the first night she would stay. Ethan prepared a small cot in the study, brought out extra blankets. April helped without speaking much, as if both were trying not to notice the quiet thrum of something unspoken between them. The storm grew louder. Snow pressed against the windows. The world outside disappeared in white. They had soup and bread, listened to Bach on the radio, read aloud. It should have felt strange, but it didn't. The house, though small, held them gently. Later, April emerged from the study, wrapped in a blanket, her notebook in hand. "I can't sleep," she murmured. "It's too quiet." Ethan smiled softly. "Sit." They sat in the living room, side by side, the fire burning low. She read him a poem she'd written that evening, about being caught between two winters. There was no metaphor in it, just her voice, honest and clear in the firelight. When she finished, she looked at him, not expectantly, not with a question, just looked. Ethan's chest tightened. There was nothing in that moment he could offer her that wouldn't break the spell. So he reached for the old quilt and gently draped it over her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. And then, without planning it, without weight, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe for a moment. The fire crackled. The wind howled beyond the walls. And inside, in that fragile hush, something settled between them. It was not a kiss. It was not a confession. It was just two people caught in a storm, sharing warmth. Ethan felt her body relax against him. He looked down at her, the crown of her head barely reaching his collarbone, and something ancient and alive stirred in him. Not lust, not guilt, just awe. That night she slept in the study, and he stayed up late, writing. The words came fast, not because he had something to say, but because for the first time in years, he had someone to say it to. The snow didn't melt for days. April stayed 2 nights. The university had cancelled classes, and the roads were impassable. But even when the sun returned and the ploughs pushed the snow into grey mountains at the end of the street, she lingered just a little longer. Neither of them spoke about that night. The silence between them had always been comfortable, but now it shimmered with a new weight, like an untouched sheet of paper waiting for the first line. Something had shifted, and both knew it. Still, they didn't name it. Naming things gave them shape, and shape could mean consequence. On Sunday morning, April prepared the tea. She moved through the kitchen like it was hers, barefoot, her hair pulled back loosely. Ethan watched her from the doorway. He didn't recognize the look on his own face. She handed him the cup, then sat across from him without speaking. The radio played softly in the background, some folk singer murmuring about roads and returns. "I don't want to go back," she said finally. Her voice didn't tremble. It wasn't a question, just a truth placed between them like a candle. Ethan didn't answer. His hands tightened around the mug. He looked older that morning, more so than she'd ever seen him. The firelight made the lines in his face seem deeper, the silver in his hair more complete. "April," he said slowly, "you know this can't become something traditional." She nodded. "I'm not asking for that." "Then what are you asking for?" She hesitated, looked down at her hands. "To be here, to be allowed to feel what I feel, even if it's not forever, even if it's just this." He closed his eyes. The ache in his chest was not pain, it was memory. Youth returning, not to stay, but to remind him it had once lived here, and maybe briefly, it had returned again. "I'm too old to give you a future," he said. April looked at him. "I'm not asking for a future, I just want the present to be honest." That broke something open in him. Not loudly, not like a shatter, more like a door creaking open in a house long shut. He reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly, and placed it over hers. They didn't speak again for a long time. Later that afternoon, April packed her bag. She didn't say when she'd return, and he didn't ask. But before leaving, she kissed his cheek, light, lingering, and whispered, "I'll carry this with me." He stood in the doorway long after she disappeared down the road. He had no words for what he felt, only the knowledge that something sacred had passed through him, and that, whatever happened next, he would never again be the same. The days that followed were slow, but not empty. April returned, though less frequently. There were midterms, presentations, the swirl of campus life she couldn't escape. Yet every visit carried the weight of intention. She brought fresh bread, new pages of poems, and once, without comment, a small framed photo of the two of them, taken unknowingly by a neighbour during one of her visits. It showed them sitting side by side on the porch, both looking off in different directions, their bodies angled just close enough to suggest something shared. Ethan had placed it near his writing desk beside Martha's picture. He didn't know what that meant, only that it felt right. The weather softened. Snow gave way to mud, then to early crocuses daring to bloom through the frost. Spring was on its way, and Ethan, though he moved slower, though his breath sometimes caught when he climbed the stairs, seemed lighter. The cane he once leaned on stayed more often by the door. But his body was not hiding the truth forever. In late March, during one of April's visits, he paused mid-sentence, his hand on his chest, and sat down abruptly. April panicked, reaching for her phone, but he stopped her. "I'm all right," he said, catching his breath. "Just sometimes the heart reminds you it's still there." She didn't believe him, but she didn't press. After that, her visits became longer again. She stopped sleeping at the dorm on weekends. They never spoke of what had been said months before, not of feelings, not of futures. But it was understood now, clearer than words. One cloudy afternoon, Ethan handed her a fresh sheet of paper. "I want you to read this to me," he said, voice unusually gentle. April unfolded it. It was a poem, untitled, short, quiet like all his others. It spoke of a winter bird perched on a branch, uncertain whether to fly, of a hand offered, palm open, not to catch, but to invite. April read it aloud. Slowly, her voice caught on the final stanza. When she finished, Ethan smiled. "That's the last one," he said, as if he were closing a door without regret. She didn't understand what he meant, at least not fully. Not yet. They sat in silence for a while. April reached for his hand. He let her take it. It was cool and soft, with veins that told of years. Outside, the clouds parted for a moment. A single beam of light fell through the window and landed on the poem in her lap. She would remember that detail for the rest of her life. He passed away, quietly. It was a Tuesday morning in early April. The air was cold, but the sky was clear. April arrived just after 9, as she always did on Tuesdays, with a paper bag of blueberry muffins and a new poem folded in her coat pocket. She called his name softly as she entered, expecting to find him in the kitchen or his reading chair. The kettle was warm, the radio playing faintly. Buck again. She found him in the armchair by the window, his favourite spot. His hands rested lightly on a closed book, his eyes peacefully shut, a faint smile on his lips. The same wool blanket she had once curled into now covered his lap. There was no fear in his face, no struggle, just stillness, as if he had fallen asleep listening to the wind and decided not to wake up. April stood frozen for a moment, the sound of her own breath louder than the music. Then she stepped forward, knelt beside him and whispered, "Thank you." She didn't cry. Not then. She sat with him for over an hour, reading aloud the poem she had brought. Her voice shook, but she read every word, ending with a line she didn't know would be their last shared moment. And so we become the space between verses, where meaning waits. Later that month, after the quiet funeral and the paperwork and the closing of accounts, April returned to the house alone. She packed his notebooks carefully. She took the framed photo from the desk. She left the blanket folded on the armchair. She'd published his poems that summer. The collection was small, just over 60 pages, printed on matte paper with soft blue covers. She titled it, "To Grow Old for You." Inside the dedication, "To the one who taught me that time doesn't measure love, it only frames it." With part of the money she earned from the book, April rented a storefront in Montpellier. She named it the Porch of Ethan, a small, warm space filled with books, readings, and weekly writing workshops for anyone who still believed that language could save them. She kept his armchair there, in the corner by the window. Years later, when people asked her if the story was real, if there had truly been an old professor and a young woman and something soft and nearly sacred between them, she never answered directly. Instead, she would read aloud his final poem, and those who listened understood. Maybe not with their minds, but deeply, with the part of themselves that had once loved quietly, or waited patiently, or let someone go gently, because the love they shared had never been about possession. It had been about presence, attention, the kind of love that doesn't burn out. It lingers like a line of poetry that changes meaning every time it's read. And in that way, Ethan never really left, certainly. Here's the final CTA in English, subtle and emotionally aligned with the story. If this story stirred something in you, even quietly, consider subscribing to the channel. Sometimes the truest kinds of love don't make noise, but they stay with us forever.